Charlemagne and the kingdom that he ruled is an important part of medieval civilization. You may often hear the word Carolingian, and Carolingian is just the adjective form of Charlemagne. Sometimes he's referred to as Charles the Great, and he left a definitive mark on early medieval culture. We think he was born around 742, but we do know that he died in 814. And a very important thing happened to Charlemagne when he was around 60 years old, and he was named the Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day of the year 800. Now this is important because it was the first imperial coronation in the West since the 6th century, and it began the revival of the Roman Empire in Western Europe. Now the Byzantine emperor, not surprisingly, considered Charles illegitimate. But despite the way the Byzantine emperor felt, Charles's coronation did mark the revival of the West. Charlemagne did some important things. One was conquering most of France, Germany, and Italy. As the ruler of this region in Europe, he established very important diplomatic relationships with other leaders, including the Byzantine emperor. He did have a rather tenuous relationship with the Muslim world, but he actually had close ties to the leader who was in Baghdad at the time. Charles asked for Christian access to holy sites in Palestine that were controlled by this leader in Baghdad, and Charles was successful in securing this and was actually given the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ is presumed to have been entombed before he resurrected. Economically, Charlemagne was able to stabilize the currency of this region under the denier. And he encouraged trade and commerce, things that are very important for an empire to be successful. Charlemagne also encouraged mass learning and mass literacy. He believed that literacy was necessary for worship because learning would provide each person with a better personal understanding of the Bible. Charlemagne himself, as an adult, undertook the task to learn to read. Now that might not seem so outlandish today, but during this time period, it wasn't really important that the ruler knew how to read, for he was considered a warrior more than anything, and the learning was to be left to the clergy. But Charlemagne believed that learning and reading was vitally important for everyone in his empire. He revised liturgical books in the church services and made chant obligatory. So he altered in some ways how people worshipped. He made church attendance and the order of the service much more accessible to the common person. And he established a feudal system of government. Now, feudalism was the socio-economic organization of Carolingian society. And Charlemagne did this in part to keep account of his vast empire. And feudalism was based on land holdings. The idea was that the monarch held all the lands, that Charlemagne, for example, owned everything. Now nobles then swore allegiance to the monarch and received lands as a gift. Other people then pledged allegiance to the nobles in exchange for a smaller piece of the nobles' land. And serfs worked for these landowners in exchange for a certain percentage of what they produced. Very similar to Southern sharecroppers at the turn of the 20th century. Typically, a serf would give a third of his produce to the lord or the landowner above him. So you see, it's a hierarchical system of government. And armies were raised when a monarch would call up the nobles pledged to him, and they in turn would call up those who had sworn allegiance to them, and so on down to the serfs. And this type of economic structure persisted until the advent of large towns. Now, I mentioned how important education was to Charlemagne. And so Charlemagne created the model for medieval schools at his palace in Aachen. He requested that a man from York named Alcuin develop the curriculum at this palace school. This palace school became the model for schools around the empire that were subsequently set up in monasteries and parish churches. Alcuin's curriculum was made up of the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These courses made up the 7 liberal arts, which for centuries constituted classical education. Most of the education during the Middle Ages went to men, although some upper-class women and women who ultimately joined monasteries became educated too.